realize how a single missile strike in Ukraine just sent shockwaves straight into Washington? And are you ready to hear why this moment could change the entire direction of the war in Europe? Do you know what's really unfolding right now behind the scenes? If you stay with me until the end, you're going to see why this moment has U.S. generals, diplomats, and allies on high alert. The world is shifting fast, and tonight's events show exactly how dangerous the next chapter could be. Tonight, we're witnessing one of those rare turning points when a conflict that feels distant suddenly reaches across oceans and puts its hand directly on America's shoulder. What started as a missile strike in Ukraine is no longer just about the battlefield. It has become a test of U.S. resolve, NATO unity, and whether Russia can intimidate the West into backing down. But how did this escalate so quickly? It all began roughly 48 hours ago, when Ukrainian forces launched a powerful, high-precision strike on a Russian military installation located deep inside occupied territory. This wasn't shelling on a trench line. This wasn't a random battlefield skirmish. This was a deliberate strike against a location Russia claims as its own, a site the international community recognizes as illegally occupied. And according to Russian officials, the strike was carried out using Western-supplied long-range missiles, weapons that Washington endorsed, and weapons specifically capable of reaching the bases Russia thought were safely beyond Ukraine's grasp. But what really pushed Moscow over the edge? It wasn't just the damage, it was the symbolism. Ukraine hit a location Russia uses as a sanctuary, an airbase, depot, or command hub that feeds its ongoing assault on Ukrainian cities. And then Moscow made its move. Suddenly and very publicly, the Kremlin summoned the U.S. ambassador to the Russian Foreign Ministry. Now that might sound like a procedural step, but in diplomacy, it's one of the final escalation points before things get truly dangerous. You do not call in the American ambassador by accident. You do it when you want to send a message not just to Washington, but to the entire world. And the message Moscow delivered? A harsh warning. Russian officials accused the United States of helping Ukraine carry out the strike, claimed the U.S. bore direct responsibility, and warned of serious consequences for what they called crossing red lines. This language isn't new, but this time something was different. The tone was sharper. The theatrics were intentional. Cameras rolled outside the foreign ministry. Reporters were pushed into position. Russia wanted this to be seen. Why? Because they're testing something. They're testing whether the United States will blink. Can you imagine the tension inside the Pentagon at that moment? Almost immediately, in Washington, the machinery of national security snapped into motion. Secure video calls launched between the White House, the Pentagon, the State Department, and U.S. commanders in Europe. The question wasn't simply, did Ukraine do this with American weapons? Everyone already knew the answer. The real question was, is Russia preparing to retaliate, and how? Intelligence teams briefed officials on what kind of missile was used, which target was hit, how accurate Russian reports were, and whether there were signs that Moscow was planning something more than just angry words. At the same time, U.S. diplomats had to decide, do we downplay this or confront it directly? Those decisions matter more than most people realize. And this time, Washington chose to answer firmly but carefully. The official U.S. message went like this. Yes, the U.S. gives Ukraine the means to defend itself. Yes, Ukraine has the right to strike legitimate military targets being used to kill civilians. No, this does not make the United States a direct participant in the war. Meanwhile, U.S. officials reiterated the same point they have made since 2022. Russia is the aggressor. Russia is the invader. Russia is violating international law every single day. But behind closed doors, the real work began. What does Washington tell Ukraine now? And what does it tell Europe? Because if Russia is openly threatening consequences for a Ukrainian strike using Western weapons, that goes straight to the heart of the entire Western strategy for 2025 and beyond. Ukraine cannot win or even survive if Russia's bases, airfields, and supply hubs remain untouched sanctuaries behind the front lines. Those locations are the backbone of Russia's war machine. They're where missiles are stored, planes take off, and logistics chains begin. Yet for months, Western support has slowly been shifting towards giving Ukraine the range and capability to disrupt those sanctuaries. So, what happens now? Here's where domestic politics inside the United States collide with global strategy. You have a U.S. public that is weary of war updates. You have debates in Congress over aid packages. You have President Trump repeatedly saying that Europe must do more, that Ukraine should consider negotiations, that America is carrying too much of the load. But at the same time, you have a bipartisan core across multiple administrations warning that yielding to Russian threats is the worst possible strategy. Every time Russia gets angry and the West backs down, the Kremlin learns the same lesson. Threats work, nuclear rhetoric works, escalation works. So, Washington faces two paths. Option 1, pull back, tighten restrictions, slow deliveries. This would calm things in the short term and embolden Moscow in the long term. Option 2, hold the line or go further. Make it clear that as long as Russia launches attacks from bases in occupied territory, those bases are legitimate targets. Which option did Washington choose? Judging from what we've seen so far, the firm tone, the reassurance to allies, the refusal to panic, it seems Washington is choosing option 2. Stay steady, stay firm. Do not let Moscow define the rules of the war it started. But here's where things get even more consequential. For months, Russia has escalated its own strike campaign. Missiles, drones, glide bombs, all aimed at Ukraine's energy system, apartment buildings, power plants, and water facilities. These attacks aren't just military operations, they're terror tactics designed to break Ukraine's morale and send a message to the West. You can't protect your ally. So Ukraine's recent strike then wasn't random retaliation. It was part of a broader effort to show Russia that distance no longer guarantees safety, that aggression carries a price. And Russia's furious reaction? It's not about principle. It's about fear. Fear that Western support is finally giving Ukraine the ability to hit back effectively. But here's the real question. What does the rest of the world see right now? Countries like China, Iran, North Korea, and others who are watching every move the U.S. makes, they're analyzing one thing. Does America stand by its allies when the aggressor pushes back? If the message is, we support you until things get risky, that sends a dangerous signal globally. But if the message is, we will not be bullied out of defending the international system, that reshapes the strategic landscape. Meanwhile, inside Ukraine, the stakes are painfully real. People aren't analyzing diplomatic phrasing. They're trying to keep warm during blackouts. They're standing in line for water because substations have been destroyed. They're burying loved ones killed in missile strikes on ordinary neighborhoods. For them, the question is brutal. Will the West give Ukraine not only weapons, but permission to hit back hard enough to change Russia's calculation? Or, every time Ukraine strikes effectively, will Washington panic about Moscow's reaction? Which brings us to the heart of tonight's breaking news. When Russia sends a harsh warning to the U.S. after a Ukrainian strike, this is not just an exchange of statements. This is a test of American resolve, a test of Western unity, a test of whether the world's democracies believe their own arguments about why this war matters. If we say borders cannot be changed by force, then supporting Ukraine means accepting that the aggressor will get angry. If we say civilians should not be targeted, then Ukraine must be allowed to strike the bases used to bomb its cities. If we say smaller nations deserve protection from nuclear-armed bullies, then we must accept the reality that those bullies will issue threats when they feel cornered. Tonight, Russia is trying to flip the narrative from Russia attacked Ukraine again to Russia is being attacked by the West. Whether that narrative succeeds depends on one thing. Washington's response. If the U.S. holds steady, calm, firm, consistent, then Russia's warning will be remembered as a sign of weakness, not strength. But if Washington flinches, if aid slows, if red lines tighten, then this moment may be remembered as the night Russia discovered that threatening consequences is enough to bend American policy.